This lecture is going to be discussing Big Pharma and the opioid crisis, in particular, thinking about Purdue Pharma and the general sort of commoditization of the healthcare industry, at least with respect to one aspect of it having to do with pharmaceuticals. So, sort of just to begin with, this pretty terrible thing has happened over the last couple of decades with the rise of people dying, most often accidentally, on the basis of overdoses from taking opiate drugs. Here is a nice chart that shows the kind of rise beginning in 1999 and going up through today in opioid related deaths, and sort of helps you, I think, see also where certain kinds of opiates actually start to come onto the market in certain places, right? So these include things like Oxycontin, but then also now things like fentanyl. And then also, of course, there's always this sort of underlying uh, run of heroin, illicit heroin in the market. So this is, just supposed to be kind of, once you've, watched the videos or thought about anything like this, you already kind of know how awful this thing is going in. There is a huge problem, this giant uptick in deaths that seem, totally preventable because they're overdose, for the most part, accidental overdose deaths by these opiates. And here too are, this is one of the main kind of perpetrators, in a sense, in this giant mess that we are in currently. Purdue Pharma, the company, and the Sackler family that started Purdue Pharma are, at the very least, kind of being seen now as partially at fault, and partially, at least, they are core to the group of people, the group of pharmaceutical companies that kind of pioneered the crisis. You know, probably in a sense accidentally, but in an attempt to make a lot of money in the pharmaceutical industry, created the giant problem that we see today. Um, and so hopefully, if you've looked at the sort of videos, the John Oliver videos and the radio interview, and maybe if you've watched the documentary that I posted on the crime of the century, it seems like, this family and Purdue Pharma is not necessarily like the only thing that's blameworthy here, right? But clearly they played a sort of key role in this sort of commodification of healthcare in order to make money. They played a key role in attempting to maximize profits, while, you know, doing some things that were problematic. Sort of in the background, if you haven't actually paid enough attention yet to everything else that was posted, Arthur Sackler and his nephew, I think it's Richard Sackler, um, they sort of changed or helped to change the entire pharmaceutical industry in the way that uh, drugs actually get marketed, right? So what they did was they stopped marketing as much to individual people, saying, "Hey, you should take this drug if you have this problem," and instead started marketing to doctors, realizing that doctors really are the ones that are going to have the knowledge to be able to help people sort of on the spot. And so what they decided was to market directly to doctors in an attempt to get doctors on board with their thinking about their drugs, so that their drugs would actually be sold, right? So um, this isn't necessarily a terrible thing, right? This is the kind of thing that seems totally all right, in a sense, from a capitalistic market-based economy point of view. You want to try and sell your products and market your products to the people that actually have control and buying power, right? Like, Saturday morning cartoons, they market like, candy cereal, breakfast cereal, and toys to kids to try and get them to get their parents to buy them. But if you were smart, you'd market toys to parents to buy them for the kids, because you know in the end the parents are the ones that have the control, that have the means. Um, Now, though there are other issues with the company, this initial thing is just one of them. But then there are other issues with the company, and this is partly why I think in the end they really are at fault and to blame. Um, the company acted in ways that subverted sort of regulatory authority. They were in bed with the FDA. They acted in ways to avoid scrutiny, and they acted in ways to take advantage of sort of misunderstandings held by doctors, at the risk of public health. All of this at the risk of public health. And so this is why I think talking about this is interesting, because in thinking about bioethics, it's also like really relevant to think about the fact that healthcare is an industry nowadays. It's an industry. It's a market that has, large forces at play. Money is a big deal. It's like, I forget how much. I think it's something like a third of the United States GDP is in the healthcare industry. Um, and so it's sort of business ethics should be at the core here. If it's sort of not obvious to begin with that ethics should be at the core of anything related to health. So now, what is that exactly is Oxycontin, or what exactly did the Purdue Pharma develop? Well, so okay, so Oxycontin is a opiate that is highly effective. It's similar to heroin. So heroin's something that's been around for a very long time. It was actually manufactured by a drug company, way back when, but now is more often made sort of illicitly. Um, the drugs, though, themselves are actually rather similar, oxy and heroin. It's just that one is, you usually use a needle to inject yourself with it, and the other one is a pill. So heroin and most needle-based drugs come with a large stigma. Um, Heroin is pretty similar to morphine, and doctors actually, mistakenly believed that oxycodone and was in some way more safe than morphine, but in fact, oxycodone is more effective than morphine. It's a faster delivery system for relieving pain. There have been studies that show that oxy is in a sense better at pain relief, in like even in surgical environments. Now, Purdue Pharma took advantage of this misunderstanding in marketing these drugs to doctors, claiming that they were safer than morphine or any of these other sort of more commonly prescribed uh, opiates that were only ever really prescribed in the first place for end of life care and things like extreme, like recovery after surgery, or cancer patients that had extreme amounts of pain, things like that. So what are opioids, right? So opioids are drugs that are distilled from opiates, and opiates come most often from poppy seeds. So poppy seeds are these kinds of plants that are cultivated most often in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan and parts of India, and they have extremely opiate effects, right? So they make you kind of docile, and you don't feel as much pain. And they're fantastic drugs, right, for their uses. They are great for extreme pain in emergency situations, in surgical situations, and recovery from surgical or emergency situations, right? They're also great for end of life care. They allow people to be cognizantly aware, as much as possible, while not feeling the extreme amounts of pain that they might be going through while they are dying. However, these drugs are extremely addictive. And, in a way, one of the things that the pharmaceutical companies more recently tried to do was talk people out of thinking that these things were so addictive. Now, opium use has been around for a very long time. I think there's plausibly from like the fourth or fifth century. However, it was usually used just as, something that you would take as a medicine to, uh, relieve some small amount of pain. It wasn't until later that people just like discovered that you could smoke it, that it started becoming highly problematic, and people actually started getting addicted to it. In fact, in the 1800s, there were two wars fought between the British and the Chinese, because the East India Trading Company really wanted to be able to import as much opium as they could possibly import into the Chinese market, because they were making a lot of money being able to do that. And but the Chinese government at the time was very, very, dynasty governments were very against it, because they saw how much of a problem it actually was, that it created, the sort of stigma notion of an opium den, being these kinds of opium dens in China, comes from this era. Um, it's unlikely, I think, ever, because this kind of drug is so potent, to be the kind of controlled substance that's not going to be abused. So it seems obvious that regulation is the best path forward for its use, given that it's so useful. However, when so if we have a drug and we think it's useful and we want to be able to use it, but we know that we need to regulate it, well, what becomes a problem is when drug manufacturers or drug pushers, in some way, drug sellers, end up being friendly with the regulatory agencies that provide the attempts at regulation. And this is kind of one of those constant battles in these market economies that we see often, right? I mean, what, like the 2008 bubble bursting in the housing markets, right? And things like that. It's always, there's market forces and people pushing against regulatory agencies, where the regulatory agency is there to try and, make things safer for consumers and make sure people don't do anything highly problematic that ends up creating a bigger problem. But the push towards laxer and laxer regulations is always there as well. And then when people kind of become friends between the agencies and the groups that want the regulations to become more lax, the regulations slowly become more lax, and this seems to happen over and over again. So now, kind of taking a step back, let's think about the ethics of drug use in general, right? So, is it ever really morally permissible to sort of take or use drugs? I mean, in a sense, obviously, yes, right? We eat foods, we uh, drink water. What's the difference between those kinds of things and certain kinds of drugs? I mean, in the past, basically for long periods of time, really, what drugs were was just you take this plant and this plant and this plant, and you mix them together, and you put them in a drink, and then you drink the drink, and it makes you feel better. Or just what counts as a drug, like alcohol in a lots of contexts seems to count as a drug, and um, it doesn't seem morally impermissible to drink alcohol in small quantities. So of course it's morally permissible to take and use drugs, but what's more interesting or sort of questionable here is whether or not it's morally permissible to ever take and use drugs recreationally. Is it the case that for non-medical, non-health related purposes, is it permissible for someone to ingest something, put something into their body that causes them to change in some way, uh, hopefully for their enjoyment, right? Of course, there are times when it doesn't work that way, but hopefully for their enjoyment. Um, is that morally permissible? Well, we can think about it in lots of different ways, right? So think about it from the three different theories that we've kind of come at so far, right? From the perspective of an Aristotelian virtue ethics framework, does the taking of certain drugs add to the flourishing of a life? Well, in some contexts, it seems like it would. In another context, it seems like it wouldn't. Does it create more happiness than unhappiness on the utilitarian framework? Sure, right? Certain kinds of drugs, as long as they're used in moderation and the right amounts, recreationally are going to create more happiness and than problems. However, I think on the Kantian framework, it's much less clear. The deontological framework puts a lot of weight on the idea of being able to do the right thing, to choose the right ends, and know how to take the right means to those ends. And I think in those cases, your rationality actually is affected oftentimes by the taking of drugs. And so, if there's going to be a good argument against sort of taking any certain kinds of drugs across the board, it's definitely going to be most easy to build this kind of argument off of a kind of Kantian framework, where the idea is that, look, you need to have your wits about you in order to be good at choosing what the right thing is to do in most all situations. And so taking things that change your cognitive state are just going to always be inherently bad in some way, because they are going to detract from your rational decision-making process. And so, in a sense, you're abusing yourself. You are not treating your own rational decision-making process as valuable as it is. You are, in some sense, like substituting your own feelings, your own emotional feelings of goodness for and you're sort of swapping your rational capacities for those feelings. And that's, on a Kantian framework, or on some kinds of frameworks like this, seems problematic. That being said, though, it's hard to sort of make that argument go all the way through. Even Kant himself thought that it was totally fine to drink alcohol. He spends a lot of time in one of his books discussing the difference between beer and wine, and why he thought that beer should never be served at a party, because it would bring people down, where wine would enliven the situation. um, so, so one thing to think about here is, like, whether or not drug use, the enjoyability that kind of comes out of drug use, ever actually outweighs the risks of addiction, overdose, and other downsides that come, health risks, like the possibility of dying, or the possibility of there being some, weird reaction. I don't know if any of you, ever took like a class like DARE. That was definitely something that I had to do when I was a kid, and we would learn about, the one guy, the one time, who was like an Olympic athlete who had never done cocaine in his life, but went out one night, drank some alcohol, did some cocaine, and the two had a bad enough interaction that he ends up dying, right? Like that seems like a pretty terrible risk. It's definitely not worth the risk of dying to try and have a good time. However, that risk is very low, right? It doesn't normally, that sort of thing doesn't happen to people. And so the risk, does the risk actually, you risk your life getting into a car every single day. So what's, is the risk really that risky? Well, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think in the end, it's probably all contextual, right? It really depends on how much the risk of addiction, how much the risk of overdose, how much the risk of certain health downfalls are. And that's going to make the things more or less permissible, right? So if you are prone to becoming addicted to things, it is much less permissible for you to try using things like heroin, right? If you are psychologically unstable, it is probably less permissible for you to use certain kinds of psychotropic substances, where you might have some kind of mental break, right? These are the kinds of considerations that are worth thinking through, and these all seem highly contextual, and so it's probably not plausible, at least initially, to think that some full-on moral prohibition on the use of any drugs recreationally is is justified by some moral argument. However, right, recreational drug use is very different than medicinal drug use. Medicinal drug use, I think, seems sort of clearly to be permissible, right? Because medicinal drug use is an attempt to use a drug for benefit, right? For benefit of your health, of your overall well-being. You use drugs to stop you from feeling pain, to help you in recovery, to help regulate certain systems of your body that are failing or slow or problematic in certain ways. sometimes for short periods of time, sometimes for long periods of time. These kinds of uses of drugs seems wholly permissible insofar as it contributes to the ability for you to live a flourishing life, to be happy, to be a rational decision-making human, alive human being. But even medical uses of drugs come with risks, right? Come with downsides, come with problems, and problematic ways things can be. So like they come with the risk of abuse. They come with the all kinds of risks to other functioning parts of your body, right? Um, Usually doctors will try to mitigate these risks, and they'll do that by informing you like what the risks are, hopefully, if they know, and also by taking into consideration before they prescribe something for you, what other drugs you're taking, and whether or not what your size, age, or like developmental state is, so whether or not the dose is safe, whether or not the drug will infringe on some abilities, right? You don't want your doctor giving you a certain kind of thing when and then telling you to that it's fine for you to go to work when it's going to stop you from being able to operate heavy machinery or something like that, right? But ultimately, in a sense, like it's up to individuals to sort of do the right thing when it comes to drug use for their own health, for their own sake, and for the sake of others. Doctors can only really give you sorts of like guidelines, right? They can give you kind of guardrails, tell you what is too much, what is too little, what things cause problematic interactions. But then they also, at least in the United States, hold the keys to sort of accessing these things. You need a prescription, you need a doctor's note in order to get access to these drugs. So but then there are also bad doctors that exist, right? There are doctors that don't do these things, and there are doctors that are looking for a quick buck and willing to write prescriptions for. But the good doctors out there try to mitigate the risks of prescribing drugs. Now, this brings us to, though, like the Sackler family argument, right? So coming back to the actual opioid crisis, the Sackler family and Purdue Pharma have released all of these opiates out into the world. I think it's to the point at which like there could be a giant like thing of pills for each individual in the United States. They've made so many of these, and so way too many. They've kind of flooded the market with these drugs, and then are trying to sell them, and then people have taken them, abused them, and died. And then when asked, sort of what they think about the situation, the Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family claim that their actions are totally justified because they're just trying to help people, right? They're just trying to alleviate pain whenever they can or wherever they can, and help doctors to do that. But then they claim that it's really the individuals themselves, the people that use and abuse these drugs, the drug addicts and the drug abusers, that are the ones that are at fault and to blame for the misuse of these drugs. And so they want to say, look, I'm not at fault at all. It's the people that are abusing the drugs and overdosing. They're the ones that are at fault for taking these drugs. And I mean, so while certainly some people do use and abuse drugs prescribed for medical purposes, there's so many different ways to abuse drugs, and only one of them is sort of taking them recreationally, right? And this is kind of, I think, the thought process behind, or the issue behind the Sackler argument is, oh, all these people, they're just abusing these drugs. It's as if they think that these people are out there trying to, you know, get their jollies by taking these drugs and then accidentally overdosing. That's not what this is, right? People are abusing these drugs not because they're doing it wrong in the sense of like trying to have fun or something like that. It's not these drugs. Everybody knows. I mean, like, there are people that take these drugs in like high school or something in order to have fun. But most of these drugs are not things that people take in order to have fun. Most of these drugs are things people take into order to self-medicate in some way, right? Because there's some other kind of larger issue at hand, right? The same reason that people drink a lot the same reason that people smoke lots of weed, right? The same reason that people do certain kinds of things, eat lots of food in certain contexts, or, people do these things in order to self-medicate from a certain place of self-medication, from a certain place of, I don't feel right, I don't feel correct, I need this thing in order to help me feel the right way that I want to feel. And that, you know, the abuse that kind of comes from that sort of place, blaming the drug user, seems much more problematic. So I think it's very unlikely that there are any drug addicts that are out there that are completely blameless in their addiction, right? I mean, there may be somebody that was forced to become a drug addict in certain situations, right? And that's a highly problematic situation, but there aren't very many of those people right out there that have been somehow become drug addicts for reasons that were completely beyond their control. So there's definitely seems to be some kind of blame that rests with people that do become addicted, right? Because they chose to continue using the drug, or they've done something very problematic in order to obtain the drug, something like that, right? And so insofar as someone has become an addict, a good chunk of responsibility surely is on their shoulders. But this kind of question, or this kind of issue, really does get to a set of core philosophical issues about the relationship between free will and moral responsibility. And we're going to talk more about this later, but it's really kind of worth kind of getting in front of your mind now already, right? Especially when thinking about, okay, so if the Sacklers are making this argument that really, they're just trying to help people by putting out these drugs, and then it's these people are using and abusing these drugs. Well, um, you can always ask a lot of questions about what it means for someone to use and abuse a drug, right? You can ask things like, okay, well, think about your own case. How many of your actions are actually free? How many of the actions that you take on a daily basis are things that you did or do because you freely chose to do them, and aren't sort of based on desires that you have that come from, you know, core aspects of your being that were only shaped because of your past. Like, right, your past happened that shaped who you are determines your desires and your beliefs, and then you act in ways on the basis of those desires and beliefs. In a sense, you're not free because you didn't shape those desires. They were kind of instilled within you on the basis of your past. So when you act in certain ways, when you choose to do what you want to do, it's like, did you really act freely in that? You didn't actually have a choice when it came to what you wanted. um then there's the question of, like, well, what could you have actually done differently? Is there, it does seem like it's possible in the moment to act in different ways, but even in acting in different ways, it seems like sometimes that's predetermined, right? If you were going to act in one way rather than another way, and you decided last minute to change your mind, how is that actually you acting freely? uh Similarly, like, if your action ultimately isn't free, say, you were predetermined in some way to do the things that you were doing on the basis of your upbringing, the history of the universe, how your desires are set up and function, and then how you've acted. But it seems like, supposing your action isn't actually free, it's determined, is it possible that you are responsible still for that action, right? If it's something that you were just unable to control, are you actually responsible? Are you blameworthy for the action if it turns out that you weren't actually free to do other than what you did? These issues all come up in, the sort of metaphysics of free will and the discussion of the relationship between free will and morality. And we'll talk about this next week when we talk more specifically about addiction and the philosophy of addiction. One thing though that you might think, to come back at the Sacklers and to kind of blame them more fully, is to say, you wait a minute, like you guys can't say this. You can't say you were just in it to help people, just in it to alleviate pain. You flooded the market with this dangerous drug. You guys are modern day drug dealers. You guys pushed and convinced doctors to prescribe dangerous drugs. You made them extremely available. You made them widely available. You put them out there into these people's hands, like without adequately informing these people that they were taking something that was dangerous and addictive, right? So, like, that's isn't that just what a drug dealer does? They give someone something dangerous and don't tell them enough about it, and then just sort of, just to take their money. Now, of course, this argument is interesting, but I think it's a little too quick, right? Surely they aren't drug dealers in the sense that we normally think of them, right? Drug dealers often try and take advantage of addicts directly in a way that gives them a kind of system of continuing to make money. Now, there are, of course, different kinds of drug dealers. There's recreational drug dealers. If any of you, I don't know, have ever purchased pot from back before it was fully legalized, that I'm sure existed, and those kind of drug dealers are probably more recreationally minded. But I'm not thinking about those. I'm thinking about, if you've seen the TV show The Wire, right? You've got these guys that are selling like crack cocaine in the projects, and it's a business for them. It's a business for them because ultimately there's just this cycle of addicts that have to go out into the world, figure out a way to make some money so that they can come and fix their habit, right? They can get their fix by buying these drugs. And then the amount of money that gets filtered through that system to the drug dealer becomes this massive amount. But ultimately, these drug dealers are purposefully trying to take advantage directly of the addicts. Whereas I think the sort of modern day drug dealer Sackler family, they're not doing that directly. They do, at least in one sense, have some kind of overarching goal in mind that seems good or acceptable. But it does seem like they really are guilty of something. They did something very bad. They did something highly problematic. And what that is or what that might be is, I think, worth questioning, right? So, what is it that they are guilty of? What is it that they did that was highly problematic? I think one of the kind of clearest things is that they are blameworthy for their intent. Um, and the intent is like what it is that's sort of behind their purpose in attempting to make and push these drugs so prolifically, right? So widely. And their intent in, acting in such a way as to obfuscate how dangerous these drugs were, both to doctors and to the general public. So, um, you might ask, sort of, okay, so what is the purpose of actually making and pushing these drugs? Well, from an actual ethical, theoretical standpoint, you want to answer one of these three kinds of questions, right? Like, was it to benefit the most people, make the most people the most happy? Is that the reason for pushing all these drugs and making them as widely available as possible? Was it an attempt to help people flourish and live flourishing lives? Or, was it because it was the right thing to do? And you sort of saw that it was the right thing to do, and you believed that it was the right thing to do, and so then you did it. I think all of those, the answer to most of those is probably no. The reason that the Sacklers did what they did and that Purdue Pharma did what it did was to make money, right? It was to make as much money as they could as a pharmaceutical company. And so the question then becomes like, was that the right thing or the wrong thing? And is that purpose, worthy of moral questioning? It's obviously seems true that there are other people that share a lot of the blame in this case, right? It's not just the Sacklers, it's not just Purdue Pharma. There are many other pharmaceutical companies that were involved here, including like Walmart and I think Johnson and Johnson. Uh, the pharmaceutical reps and sales people are definitely at partially at fault. If you watched any of the documentaries and things, there are people that literally would just kind of lie when talking to insurance companies about what patients had, like what ailments patients had, in order to get them to be approved for these kinds of drugs so that these drugs would sell better. There are doctors, that are at issue, right? There's first one side, the doctors that were ignorant when they shouldn't have been about these drugs, um, and then other doctors that actually acted out wrongly, right? There are bad doctors in there out in the world. Pipeline pharmacies, right? So there are instances of these, like, CVS pharmacy or something like that in the middle of this very small town. And people are driving for miles and miles around in order to fulfill their prescriptions at this pharmacy because they know that this pharmacy will give them this prescription refill with, like, sort of no questions asked, because the money is just funneling through. And then also FDA regulators, like people in the regulatory agencies that allowed these kinds of things to slip through their fingers without actually being sort of questioning enough. But so this brings us, I think, to what we should be thinking about at the core of this entire debate, this entire issue is, what exactly is the purpose of healthcare, and what exactly is the purpose of the healthcare industry or business, right? So healthcare aims at providing health, right, for everyone. Aims at uh, bringing about the most health for the most people, in a sense, right? That's what the business, like, that's what the point of trying to provide healthcare to a person is to try and get them healthy and then get them to stay healthy. Um, Whereas the kind of, the purpose of having a business, at least in a kind of capitalistic for-profit type market, is to make as much money as possible, right? Is to kind of dominate the marketplace in such a way that you are able to make as much money as possible. Now, what about the healthcare business, right? If you try to combine these two things, what is the purpose of a healthcare business? Is it to make money by promoting people's health? Or is it to promote health in order to make money? Like, how exactly should we think about these two things when put together? Um, what becomes kind of obvious is, like, it's clearly possible to make money while promoting health and to promote health while making money, right? Um, People have done this time and time again in different ways by inventing things and coming up with new procedures that cost a lot, right? Surgery itself, hospitals definitely make money providing healthcare services. But the issue here is, what about when the two things conflict, right? When promoting health and making money conflict, when it is possible to make more money by not fully promoting health, or when it stops being possible to make money because, like, when promoting health requires the loss of a certain amount of money, right? And this is one of those interesting and large kinds of questions here. Should it be the case that promoting healthcare comes outside of the idea of making money? Should it be promoted for its own sake beyond this reasoning, right? Um, and there are things that are really interesting to sort of think about here. Certain kinds of procedures are unbelievably expensive to enable, right? To undertake. And if someone doesn't have the money or in order to undertake this procedure, um, should it be undertaken? I mean, even if it takes away a lot of money from the hospital or other other people, right? Um, what's the right thing to do in these cases? How do we actually fairly distribute money, resources, you know, drugs to people in such a way that we are able to actually help them, without sort of running afoul of uh, the system breaking down, because money becomes a secondary thought, and the actual means to run everything stops being taken seriously. So these kinds of issues, I think, arise, and they become really, really problematic when we start thinking about the conflict between the two. Um, clearly, promoting health is of utmost importance, and I think should come first, right, before making money. But we also need to think about how the system perpetuates, how the healthcare system is able to keep on its feet, uh, and unencumbered by doing things that are just too uh, outlandish in an attempt to save everyone's health all at the same time, right? Um, so, this is where the conflict kind of lies, and that's what's worth thinking about, I think, for the rest of this lecture. So, um, let's think about how pharmaceutical companies are structured for a minute. So, most large pharma companies don't actually develop brand new drugs. Um, what they do instead is they acquire smaller companies that have already kind of come up with or done the research on, developed some new drugs, or they'll purchase these drugs from these companies, because for the most part, the big pharma companies, what they do have is large distribution networks. They are able to take these drugs, manufacture them in large quantities, and get them into individuals' hands all over the world, right? Because they have the ability to put them into these, uh, pharmacies. Um, what what large pharmaceutical companies do often, though, is attempt to find and repackage already approved drugs for new uses. So things like there are lots of famous cases of this. One is like the case of Viagra, right? So Viagra was initially a heart medication, that was good for regulating a certain kind of thing for how your heart was going to be, and then it also just so happens to cause uh, long-lasting erections, and so ultimately got repackaged into one of the most successful, uh, less than perfectly health-related right, um, drugs available on the market today. Pharmaceutical companies, the large pharmaceutical companies, do this all the time. They take things that they try out specific kinds of drugs that are already through the regulation process, uh, and see if they have other effects that they can use them for to prescribe, so that they can avoid the costly, difficult endeavor that goes into developing a new actual drug, right? It's extremely difficult and costly to develop new drugs. There's lots of regulations, there's lots of sort of long-term testing that has to go on, lots of experimentation, lots of money has to be spent. And often promising drugs that seem initially like a good idea, end up getting shelved for lots of different reasons, like allergic reactions, unforeseen side effects, just because they don't work as well as they could work, and the side effects don't seem to, like, the side effects outweigh how effective the drug is. um so there's this kind of common argument, I think, that gets raised, especially about the United States pharmaceutical industry, and it's that, look, there needs to be these super large payoffs for successful drugs to go through this extremely costly and long process of regulation, testing, and money. There has to be these extremely large payoffs, so large that if they didn't exist, then there would be fewer companies that would be participating in this industry. There'd be less competition in this industry that would exist. There'd be less progress made in drug development. And so, we wouldn't have as many new, cancer fighting drugs, or new drugs to put an end to Alzheimer's, or new drugs to, like, what is it? The recent drug that has basically kind of stopped the transmission of HIV, which is amazing. Like, the thought is, we need these massive payoffs, these massive, like, these abilities for these companies to keep these drugs, and be able to sell them for profitable amounts. We need that. Otherwise, there just wouldn't be enough competition in the marketplace, and there just wouldn't be the development of these drugs uh, at all. And so we wouldn't progress as we have been, as quickly or as successfully as we have been over the last, 50 plus years when it comes to pharmaceutical industry. But it's interesting. It's like, what should we actually think about this, right? It's if this is true, and that we need really the current system to kind of keep innovating and keep creating new drugs, does the ends really justify the means there, right? Does it, like, the current system led to things like the opioid crisis, and if that's the means to get to the ends, right? If the making them tons and tons of money off of these drugs in one way is the only way to actually achieve saving lives in the future, do the ends really justify the means? I mean, it seems like we're sacrificing people now in order to save people later. Maybe they do, because maybe we'll actually save that many more people later. But currently, it doesn't seem that great. I mean, it seems like one of those things that's like, it's very problematic from some perspectives to think that, we're actually sacrificing people now for people later, right? You know, we're violating individuals' rights in a sense, right? In order to possibly promote more life, more health later in the history of, the country. Um, Further, though, is it really actually true that the system as it stands needs to stay the same way? Or could things be broken up and regulated in lots of different ways? Could we not, like, put new drug production into the hands of scientists that are funded publicly through universities or through science foundation grants, right? We could pay the US government less and put more money into making more people more healthy, right? Not pay the government, the military. Um, uh, is it also true? I mean, is it really true that the system as a whole is necessary, right? Or could the system itself be broken into sectors where different sectors could be treated differently? Namely, the sectors that are taking already approved drugs and just trying to repackage them and remarket them and make more money off of them in different ways. Couldn't that be treated much differently from the sectors of the market that are involved in actually attempting to produce like new drugs for novel purposes, for novel health issues? Um, I think, it seems to me very problematic to think that the ends justify the means in these kinds of cases. If it is true that the system needs to, continue as is, and I think that it's very questionable that the system as is must stay as is, right? It seems that it is quite probable that it could be changed. Um, this brings us to sort of wrapping up here. It's worth thinking, I think, about what kinds of punishment might be justified for the kinds of wrongdoing that are occurring in these cases, and then what it actually means to sort of move forward beyond these kinds of cases. What is it that we can learn from these kinds of cases, and what kinds of things can we try to avoid in the future? So, first of all, there are lots of different kinds of punishment that people, might think is justified in this kind of case. Massive fines. That's actually what was doled out. Prison terms, maybe, right? I mean, some of these people, if they're making these decisions with sort of ill intent, it seems like maybe some people should go to prison. The death penalty. I mean, that's like a little bit of a joke, but in a sense, if you made a decision that caused a huge amount of people to die, uh, maybe death should be on the table. I don't think so. But so here, what actually happened for Purdue Pharma, at least initially, is so the Sackler family was able to avoid having most of the blame. The pharmaceutical company itself has taken on most of the blame and has had to pay massive amounts of money in order to kind of help rectify the situation. Nowhere near as much money as actually is necessary to help rectify the situation. And the settlement, as far as I understand it at this point, to keep them from completely going into bankruptcy, to complete this, to stop this, So the way that it works is the company has to pay a certain amount of money over a long period of time. And in order for them to actually pay that money over this long period of time, they have to continue to be in operation as a business. And in order to continue to be in operation as a business, they have to continue selling the drugs that are so highly problematic, that have caused this crisis. And, if they're going to keep doing that, then they're probably going to keep marketing them in ways that are, in a sense, profitable for them to market them, which I mean, this is a whole other ethical quandary, ethical loop situation that's worth thinking about for its own sake. But that aside here, this brings up, I think, a really deep ethical question about the purpose of punishment, especially the purpose of punishment when it comes to these kinds of seemingly white-collar crimes that led to massive problems, like social problems, and massive amounts of death, right? Literally seems like the kind of thing that was somebody made a decision somewhere to market something and to sell something and to perpetuate a certain kind of falsehood without any intent on harming anyone really, and then a massive amount of harm comes from it. So what is the purpose of punishment in this kind of situation, in this kind of case? If we are to punish, say, the Sacklers, what ultimately comes from it? Does punishment in this case actually sort of bring justice, right? Where justice can be thought of as like, uh, you know, some kind of fairness back to the world. Um, does punishment rectify the situation? Does it make the situation better in some way? Would punishment actually cause, would punishment bring education in the sense that, like, the Sacklers, at least to now, don't think that they ever did anything wrong? And so would punishment be useful if it taught them, the perpetrator, that they did something wrong and then showed the public what was done was wrong? Or would the punishment create more disincentive for people to do the same kind of action in the future, right? Would that justify a certain kind of punishment of them? And does the what then the question becomes also, what kind of, like, what severity of punishment is necessary in order to actually act as a, proper disincentive? Finally, I think it's sort of worth recognizing that we have a seriously broken system. If in the pursuit of profit, we can, sacrifice so many lives, right? If profit comes at such a cost, it seems highly problematic. Um, I think it isn't even entirely clear how to disincentivize this kind of activity by, like, especially through punishment. Um, if the group of people don't get punished, but the company does, the company ends up having to go bankrupt or something, or fold, or pay a lot of money. Like, what even is it to it's disincentivizing a certain business practice where uh, the business ends up failing, but lots of people ended up dead. So what is the give and take here? What is the give and take at all? No, people aren't going to start these kinds of businesses at the risk of them failing. I don't see it, right? Just because you foresee the possibility of a business failing, every business might fail in the future for various reasons. That doesn't seem like a good enough reason to not start a business with a certain kind of model. Um, what else might have been done? I mean, or what might be done now? Like, maybe we could make healthcare more universal. This is one of these sort of arguments that goes like, look, in the rest of the world, healthcare works very differently, and pharmaceutical industry works very differently. And because of the way that it works differently, you don't end up with these same kinds of problems. Um, Maybe adding a higher amount of regulation, or regulation on the regulators, would be the kind of thing that could be done now to help, but it is still highly questionable. Um, but I think sort of instead, one just hear me out, right? Philosophy of ethics teacher here, trying to sort of say what I think the ills of the world are and how they can be fixed. How about instead we all just try to do the right thing, rather than do even only slightly immoral things for the sake of profit, right? This seems to be the constant business ethics issue, right? When it comes to corporations or companies doing things immoral, or doing things that are ultimately socially highly problematic, it's almost never because one person that was high up made one immoral decision that cascaded into a giant mess that caused a huge moral problem. Instead, it's usually almost always a lot of very small decisions to do something that seemed a little bit morally questionable. And all of these things kind of eventually added up to create an entire problem, right? So here we think, there was some slight fibbing on the part of the Purdue Pharma representative team about the danger and efficacy of a drug. There was some outright lying that was going on for the sake of making profit by pharmaceutical sales reps, and people that were contacting insurance companies to have things approved in certain ways. Um, there are individuals that probably, you know, abused their prescriptions and became addicts partly because of that abuse. Um, each of these things seems like a small mistake, a small error, but once they are taken together, it seems that they rise into this much larger problem. And so what I think obviously is the best way forward is to try and avoid making these small mistakes early on at the beginning. All right, that ends the lecture for today. See you all tomorrow.